Blog Talk Radio.
Alternative facts.
The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. At 12:07 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, numerous unidentified objects of unknown intent and unknown origin were detected at high altitudes over multiple locations of Earth's outer space by the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and these objects are presumed to be some form of controlled aircraft. It is not known if more of these aircraft will arrive, or if they will attempt entering Earth's atmosphere. United States citizens are encouraged to monitor local media outlets, as more updates will follow as information becomes available. The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. Attacks by the undead have been reported in several states across the country. The dead are rising from their graves and are attacking the human race. At this time, it is expected that more attacks of this nature will occur in several other states in the next few hours. The intent behind their attack is unknown at this time. He has been observed that a byte or exchange of fluids is a method of transmission. This is an extremely dangerous situation if they crave the taste of human flesh. It is not known whether this event will last for hours, days, or even longer. Stay calm, as authorities have been dispatched to deal with these creatures. An all-clear siren will be sounded when this situation is under control. Pacific Standard Time, nor is detected a long-range nuclear missile launcher. This missile is believed to be headed in the direction of all residents within a 400-mile radius of this area should seek a fallout shelter immediately.
Welcome to Within the Chaos with your host, Rodney, the Viking Shortridge. Want to give a big old shout out to the Facebook paranormal groups that allow us to post our shows on their pages and helping us to get the word out about all of our guests. If anyone would like to speak to Black Diamond Paranormal Society, BDPS, to discuss your paranormal questions or issues, go to our website at blackdiamondps.org or email blackdiamondps@yahoo.com. As always, our services are free.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. You can listen in by calling 516-387-1922, or you can go to the Vibe Radio Network website at blogtalkradio.com/Vibe Radio Network. For deep within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for listening to Within the Chaos. My name is Rodney Shortridge, and I'll be your host tonight. First off, I'd like to give a shout out to my cousins up in Ohio, Jennifer and Joe Shortridge of 222 Paranormal. If you get a chance, check out their talk show. You can find them on Facebook under 222 Paranormal.
Well, howdy, everybody.
Tonight, our special guest is Adam Stokes. Adam has degrees in religion from Duke University and Yale Divinity School. His work deals with a wide range of subjects from religion to the Greco-Roman culture to ancient American history. He is the author of the book From Egypt to Ohio, a Semitic origin for the giants of North America. Currently available on Amazon.com. He has published numerous articles and reviews and appeared on several podcasts. He currently teaches Latin language at Allentown High in New Jersey and a course on the Old Testament at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I hate to say, but you know, we've met another terrible milestone here in America with 122,000 deaths over the COVID-19. I know we got hot spots with the virus in Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California. And people, I know a lot of you people think that wearing a mask is somehow taken away from your freedom. But apparently masks help save lives. So, you know, you might need to think twice before you go into a store or out near a lot of people. Due to social distance, wear a mask. And, you know, I also think about the heroes of the nurses and doctors and the nursing staff that are fighting so hard every day to try to save lives. And also, I know we're making some ground on police reform, and with the ongoing protests around the world for BLM. Me and my daughter had a small protest at our local town this past Sunday. We had a few people come by, and you know, of the African American community, and in support. We had a few cops there, but we didn't have no trouble with nobody. You know, got a couple, you know, middle fingers or thumbs down and stuff. But hey, everybody keeps saying all lives matter. That's true, but Black lives matter a whole lot, especially when there's so many of them dying under the knee or gun of a white officer. It's just time for reform. But enough of me going on. Let's get Mr. Stokes on. Let me see. We click over here. Hello, Adam. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I hear you just fine. I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's an honor to have you on tonight, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from you.
I hope so. I'll do my best, but it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome, sir. First question is, could you give us a little bit of information, you know, about yourself and what started you on this path of studying and researching? Because you go over a lot with the religion, Greco-Roman culture, and ancient American history.
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place, Rodney, and a lot of that has to do with certain events that happened in my own life. Now, I'll start off by saying I've always loved ancient history. When I was a little kid, a lot of it had to do with my dad. He used to watch these old Roman Empire movies, these movies about Greek mythology. So I've loved ancient history ever since I can remember. And I always wanted to do something that involved ancient history. And came from a very religious background. I'm still a very religious person myself. And so I was really interested in the stories found in the Bible. And so I went into college. I majored in religion and with a focus on biblical languages. So Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And I thought I would go on to do a PhD. I did some doctoral work. Long story short, didn't quite work out the way I expected it to. So I was like, if I can't teach, you know, as a tenured faculty at some fancy college, what can I do with my skills and what I know? So I started my second passion outside of biblical studies was the Latin language and the Greco-Roman world. So I started to teach high school Latin, which I've loved. I've loved being at Allentown, wonderful students. So that kind of pushed me towards kind of Greco-Roman history. And then my own interest, both from my own religious affiliation as a Mormon and just my interest in American history more specifically, led me to wanting to research about ancient America and to basically see whether the claim that has often been made is true, whether or not whether or not the American history that's being given to us is correct and accurate, or is there much more than we think is going on? So sorry for rambling, but that's basically me in a nutshell.
Oh no, don't worry about rambling. It's not right. That's information. I love it. It makes my job a lot easier. Well, I'll start off with some religious questions then. What types of religion have you researched, and what has your research found within those religions, and are they similar, or are they just so far different that is that the reason why the world has got so much hate towards each other's religion?
Yeah, that's a really important point that you make. So I've studied basically most of the major religions under the sun. So I went into college, and my focus was in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible and learning the different languages. But for my college major, you had to take a secondary religion, and so I ended up taking a course on Islam. And this is crazy, Rodney. I always mention this. When 9/11 happened, the day 9/11 happened, I was taking a morning course in Islamic civilization, and a big fight broke out over, what had just happened with the towers and everything, and people were arguing, Islam is a religion of peace. This isn't really what Islam is. And people were saying, oh, this is what Islam is. So there was a whole debate back and forth there. But I've studied Islam. In graduate school, when I went to Yale, I studied a little bit of Hinduism, and you see a lot of similarities between the different religions. So if you compare Greco-Roman religion, the Hindu faith, and Judeo-Christianity, a lot of the stories are ridiculously similar. So you have stories of mighty heroes, Samson in the Bible, Heracles in Greco-Roman mythology, Arjuna in Hindu mythology. I think a more explicit example is that all of these religions contain accounts of some great cataclysm or flood that happened in the ancient past. And so for myself, a lot of people look at religion and say this is just mythology, this is just metaphor, these are just illusions. But I look at the similarities between religion, especially with something like the flood story, and it suggests to me that we are talking about historical events which have been elaborated on in the different religious scriptures, but that they all go back to these historical events that actually took place. So I think there's a lot more in common with the different religions than there are differences.
Okay. Well, the biblical stories that are in the Bible, aren't they part of texts or older civilizations that these stories have either been passed on or copied from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so. Yeah, exactly. I think the flood story is a great example of that. So the Noah flood story in Genesis chapter 6 through 9 in the Old Testament, that's basically very similar to what you get with a much older text called the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient Near Eastern religion. And at the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a guy named Utnapishtim who Gilgamesh goes to. Gilgamesh has a BFF named Enkidu, and Enkidu suddenly dies. He gets sick and he dies. So Gilgamesh goes around trying to find the secret to eternal life. And he finds this guy named Utnapishtim who talks about how he was granted eternal life by the gods because he was the only righteous person on earth, and the gods killed everybody with a big deluge, with a big flood. So there's direct influence of Gilgamesh on the story of Noah's Ark in the Bible. And also, if you look at the Old Testament law, so the first 5 books of the Bible, which Jews call the Torah and which Christians call the Pentateuch, the structure of a lot of the laws in there mirrors what you get in Hammurabi's Code and also in Near Eastern Hittite treatises. So there's a lot of influence and borrowing from earlier stories. The story of Moses in a basket was likely inspired by the story of Sargon II. When he's a baby, he's also put in a basket. So, yes, lots of borrowing going on. So the Bible is just, and I don't mean this in an offensive way because I'm a religious person who does believe in the Bible, but in some ways the Bible is just a plagiarized, modern, what's the word I'm looking for, reboot of much earlier, much more ancient stories.
Okay. So, because, I went to church a lot when I was a kid and stuff, and I've heard a lot of preachers, just screaming at us, say this is the word of God.
They like to do that.
Oh, yeah. There's one preacher, I went to church, he was bald-headed, and he'd get up there preaching and screaming and hollering. The veins looked like they're about to pop out on top of his head, and I'm like, he's going to have a stroke. He's going to calm down.
It's funny because I was raised, I'm Mormon now. I'm a part of the RLDS church, but I was raised Black Baptist, basically, and kind of like I'm sure your tradition was the tradition you were raised in growing up was very similar. Like you said, the guy's yelling at the top of his lungs. There's no air conditioning in the church, so, sweat's just pouring down off of him, and I'm certain the dude's going to pass out, but he never does. So, go figure.
Yeah, I was raised Pentecostal holiness, so, they done all kinds of weird stuff, and I was like, is this normal?
Yeah.
Well, what is the reason why people, need religion?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of answers to that, Rodney. I think that one, religion has at its best. Now, we've seen plenty of examples of religion being, divisive and tearing people apart and tearing nations and cultures apart. That certainly happens. But I think at its best, religion can be unifying. Individually, a person can find a sense of community within a religious community, whether that be a temple or a mosque or a church. So individually, also collectively, I think when religion is used positively, it can bring people together, people of different races, people of different backgrounds. So I think, people need that. I also think that, it's innate in us to ask the question of where do we come from, who created us, and why. And so I think, religion attempts to answer a lot of those questions. Now, those questions can be answered from a scientific standpoint, that there wasn't anybody who created us. There was just a big bang and evolution and stuff like that. But I think for a lot of people, and I kind of toe the line here, because I think there are some aspects of evolution which are correct, but I think that by and large, the fossil record that we have, and I'm not a biologist, so I don't mean to sound too arrogant about it, but the fossil record that we have doesn't really support it. But I think, for a lot of people, especially people who are religious, their scriptures, their sacred texts provide answers into about where they come from.
Okay. Well, here's a question I get a lot, especially when I speak to people such as yourself that are very religious. How can a powerful and all-loving God either create or allow evil to exist?
Oh gosh, Rodney, that's a big one. I was I was trying to write my dissertation on that when I was doing my PhD, and you can see why I didn't finish it. But yeah, that's a great question. I think religious scholars, theologians would say that's the issue of theodicy. Why do you have this evil in the world? if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God. I think, my own tradition, I think there's a couple of things that you could argue. You could take the von Daniken, Zechariah Stitchin route and say that what is deemed God, quote unquote, were really extraterrestrials or a race from another planet, from another universe that came down and were worshipped by humans as gods, and they left. So even though humans continue to worship them, they're no longer around to influence things, and so humans are basically left on their own. And when you leave us on our own, bad things happen. So that's one way you could put it. I think my own faith, not trying to proselytize here, but there is a notion in Mormonism of progression. One how can I put it, becomes more and more divine. And so as one progresses through life into the afterlife, they gain greater divinity. And I think that helps to explain why things are imperfect in our world. Because in Mormonism, God is not perfect. God is continually, what's the word I'm looking for, evolving, continually becoming perfected, but is not perfect yet. It's interesting because in Hebrew, the term for God is Eye Asher Eye. When Moses asked God for God's name in Exodus 3, God says Eye Asher Eye, which is always translated I am that I am. But the Hebrew is an imperfect verb, meaning I will be. So that means, implying right there that when we talk about God, we're not talking about something, and this is a challenge to traditional Christian orthodoxy. We're not talking about someone who is all perfect, but is in the process of becoming perfect, who's imperfect now, but is in the process of becoming perfect. And when you look at it like that, I think can help somewhat to kind of explain the imperfections in the world. Just as God is imperfect, so are human beings imperfect. But it doesn't explain everything. So, I think that's the big. I think your question is the big baby, the big challenge to religion. All religions preach a loving, caring God. So what's going on here? And I think at the end of the day, no religion can effectively answer it. I think that the Old Testament does it best. So if you read it in Ecclesiastes, basically Ecclesiastes says crap happens, the wicked prosper, but all you can do is try to live your best life. God has given you the ability to have pleasure in life, sexual pleasure, the pleasure of friendship, the pleasure of good food even. So just enjoy those things, which doesn't resolve the theodicy problem, but I think it's an attempt to answer it, and I think it's a pretty good attempt, if I may say so.
I think it's great. What is the most bizarre Bible story that you would consider just, I can't believe this is even wrote in the Bible?
Oh, gosh, where do I begin? There are a lot of them, especially they're all over the place, especially in the Old Testament. New Testament's a little bit more normal, though it has its weird stories as well. I think that for myself, the top two or top three, Ezekiel's vision with the wheel in the wheel. What the heck is going on with that? What is that thing? Von Daniken and others, I think, somewhat correctly, they say it was probably an extraterrestrial encounter, a UFO encounter. Then I would say right after that, possibly one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is the Witch of Endor story. She's not really a witch, but she that term is not used in the Hebrew, but she consults with the dead, and she's able to bring back the prophet Samuel, who is stone dead, super dead. She brings him back to life, and I was like, that's kind of a really cool story. But But what's going on there? What the heck is going on there? I don't know. And then I think just as kind of a fun story, you have the shibboleth in the story of Gideon, where Gideon tells the people. Gideon's one of the judges of Israel, and he tells the people to pronounce shibboleth, and it's basically determining where a person is from based on the way that they pronounce it. So, to give an example, I used to live in South Germany for a while, and the way that they speak German is different than Northern German. So they'll say "ich," like everything is like "sh" instead of "ich," which you would get with like Berlin speakers and stuff like that. So back to Gideon, he says, pronounce shibboleth this way, and the people who pronounce it the way he doesn't want them to pronounce it, he kills them on the spot. So I was always like, what's up with that story? But from a supernatural, paranormal perspective, Ezekiel's vision and the Witch of Endor are the two, in my opinion, most two bizarre stories in the Old Testament.
Okay. This is sent in by one of the audience. Says, does God answer prayers and perform miracles? And if so, where's the proof of legitimate evidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can only speak for my own experience, but I do think that there have been people in the past who have encountered God, through prayer. And I think that at times there have been legitimate miracles that have happened. Now, they don't happen often. They don't happen a lot. But I do think that in some cases miracles do occur. And I'll give an example from my own life. When I was in grad school, I was married to my wife. We had my first son, Grayson, who's 7 now. He was a baby then. And we were flat broke. I was trying to find a job, couldn't find a job. My wife had just gotten out of law school. She was trying to find a job. We were just flat, utterly broke. We were doing state assistance and stuff, and it was a really rough time for us, Rodney. And we were living in this, basically, for lack of a better word, piece of crap apartment. And we had gotten, our sister-in-law had gotten us this free timeshare. And we were debating, because we didn't even have enough money that we thought for gas. But she said, go down there, everything else is paid for. So I remember this, we were debating in the morning whether to go or not go, and we decided to go. And when we left back to the piece of crap apartment, the ceiling in our apartment caved in, and it caved in right on top of our TV. Now, this is significant because my son at the time, he was learning how to crawl, and he'd always stand at the TV to watch Elmo and Sesame Street. And so if he had been there, which he would have been if we had not left, the roof would have fallen, or the ceiling would have fallen right on top of him and likely killed him. And so I always took that to be, an example of a miracle of where God or angels, however you want to call it, is watching over us. So I do think miracles occur. They're just not as frequent as sometimes people expect them to be.
Wow. Well, what is your opinion about the afterlife?
Yeah, you're spitting fire this evening, Rodney. Yes. So my opinion on the afterlife. So I think that, I think that a lot of times when you read about the afterlife in ancient text, if you take kind of the Von Däniken Stitchin model, the other world may literally be another world, another planet or something where the extraterrestrials deemed as gods came from. So I think that that's one perspective you can have. Now, in my own tradition, the notion of an afterlife is very, very important. I talked about that notion of eternal progression into the afterlife. For myself personally, I always I think of my relationship with God as not something that takes place necessarily in an afterlife, but that the fullness of it is in human experience now. So I tend to focus on, being a religious person or trying to be a religious person to the best of your ability in this present life and enjoying the blessings of God in this present life over and above expecting blessings in an afterlife. But I don't dismiss the existence of an afterlife.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is your opinion on the future of religion and all religious institutions?
Yeah, honestly, Rodney, I don't know if it's such a bright future. I think that this goes back to a couple of the questions you were asking earlier. Religion, for me, it's a very powerful and it's a positive thing. But for the world collectively, religion, at least in its present form, has done a lot of damage. And I think that, and you see this especially with millennials, there's kind of a turning away from traditional religion, from Christianity. And so I don't think religion will die, but I do think it will be transformed into something else. And I always I joke with my wife about this because I watch the shows Ancient Aliens and stuff a lot. But I think that is kind of the trajectory where religion is going to go, kind of with kind of a fusion of the scientific, the science fiction, and the spiritual, where you have, people believing that, the gods were, ancient extraterrestrials visiting us in the past. And I kind of see, if you go to Alien Con or any of these UFO cons, you kind of see that there's this new kind of spiritual movement revolving around that, which is in some ways connected to Christianity because it draws a lot on the Bible as an ancient text, an ancient witness to extraterrestrial encounters, but sees itself as distinct and different from Christianity, from Judeo-Christian tradition as well. And I think, honestly, Rodney, that I'm hoping, as a Mormon, I hope that I believe my religion will still be around, but I think that in large part, a lot of these Christian traditions and basically your standard religions in the West, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they're either going to be much less influential or they're going to just disappear entirely.
Would that be a bad thing?
Yeah, that's, for me, yes, because I consider myself a religious person. I consider I read the Bible, I read the Book of Mormon as my scriptures. But, in my opinion, for myself, and I can only speak for myself, yes, but I think that for the world in general, it might be a good thing. I think that a lot of times we have too much religion, and a lot of the divisions that we have, racial, ethnic, whatever you want to call them, are, if not promoted by religion, if not having their source in religion, are definitely enhanced by religion. So I think that if, our current religious paradigm goes away, some of these problems, some of the stuff you were talking about earlier at the beginning of the show, might actually have a chance to be resolved. So, I'm gonna say, maybe for humanity it wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, switching it up a little bit. What was the Greco-Roman culture, and how did it influence our world?
Oh gosh, so yes, so you're touching on my other favorite thing. So, the Greco-Roman culture was basically the fusion of Greek culture and later Roman culture. So the Greeks had a pantheon of gods, Zeus, Hera, etc. And these gods weren't really all that popular with anyone outside the Greeks until Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great comes along in, I believe, the 3rd century BCE, and basically, 4th century BCE, and basically conquers most of the known world. And when he does that, he basically spreads Greek influence to basically every corner of the world. And when the Romans come to power in what's now Italy, a couple centuries after that, they basically plagiarize and basically steal all the Greek gods and change their names. So Zeus becomes Jupiter, Hera becomes Juno, etc. Hespatius becomes Vulcan. So they change basically all their names to Latin to Roman names. So they basically keep that Greek religion, and what becomes Greco-Roman religion is basically the religion of the land up until the rise of Christianity. And it doesn't die out immediately when Christianity comes on the scene. It lasts for about another 400 years until the time of Hypatia of Alexandria, when she's killed in, I believe, 425 CE. But it's important, it's very important, because basically the foundation of Western civilization comes from Alexander the Great. So Alexander spreads Greek culture everywhere, and especially in Europe, that influence never dies out. So America, coming from the old world, is very much influenced by that Greek, Greco-Roman, or classical culture. And a lot of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they saw America as being kind of a new Rome, and they were very much influenced by classical Greco-Roman culture. And so I tell my students, because I teach Latin, and my students are always like, why are we taking this boring course? Why are we taking this language that people don't speak anymore? Well, you're taking it because it'll give you a better insight into where you come from and how we got to be the civilization that we are today. So that particular culture, more than any other, was very influential on, Western civilization.
Well, with the problems that they had, the Romans in their time, especially with their rulers, are we seeing something similar today with Trump, especially with the foundations of our democracy? Seems like it's cracking and maybe even crumbling.
Yeah, I don't often get into politics that much, but I think, it's funny you mention that, Rodney, because one of my favorite movies is a movie called The Fall of the Roman Empire, with the dude who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars movies, not Ewan McGregor, but Alec Guinness. He plays the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And there's a scene in there where at the end of the movie, basically everything goes to complete chaos, and this dude is walking by, and he's basically, the barbarians are just smashing up things, burning down things, stealing things, and basically, even though Rome technically did not fall at that time, this was Marcus Aurelius was the 2nd century CE, it won't fall until the 5th century CE. So even though it technically didn't fall, they say it was the fall of the Roman Empire because that was when Rome started to decline, because it just basically became a free-for-all and a crap show. And I was looking at that movie the other day, and with everything going on, I was noticing that even here in Jersey, I was driving and I saw a tow truck with this smashed-in police car, just all smashed the heck up, and you could tell that it wasn't a car accident, it had been basically vandalized. And I was wondering if we're starting to have a similar decline as the Roman Empire. I think clearly, whatever side of the fence you're on, if you're Democrat or Republican, I think that our politicians, like the Roman politicians, have kind of failed us, and they're much more concerned, about themselves than they are the common people. And I think if they don't get it together, America's going to fall apart, just like the Roman Empire did. And I know you were talking about the recent protests and stuff, and the majority of the protests have been, very peaceful. And I've really admired how, people of all races have come together with these protests. But there was a time, I know, right in the aftermath of George Floyd, where there was, massive rioting, and we weren't really getting the best of responses from the guy in the White House, and I wondered, if this whole thing was going to fall apart, and it would just be, the United States was split up into, all the states were split up into different countries of their own. It's interesting because before I taught at Allentown, I taught at a rather rough school in Trenton, and we had police who were at the school, and I would have hall duties, so I'd sit and talk to them a lot. And one of the dudes was an older police officer who, when he was young, had served in the Bronx in New York City, and he always tells me a very funny story. He says when he got switched to Times Square in Manhattan, he was so happy because nothing ever happens there because it's all just the touristy people and such. But he worked in the Bronx for a while. He worked there in the 70s when there was a lot of rioting. He said, I thought several times that we would lose the city. Like there was no way that the police would be able to maintain order in the city. And there have been times the past couple of months when I thought something similar would happen as well. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from the Roman Empire. And as a historian, I tell people it's a cheesy, hokey phrase, but if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I definitely think there's some parallels there.
I agree. Well, we said earlier that you have studied ancient American history. What has your research found fascinating about American ancient history?
Yeah, I think the most fascinating thing I found is that American history, in the words of Scott Walter, is completely wrong, meaning that the history that we learned, that basically there was no civilization here before Columbus, is completely wrong. And so a lot of my work looks at kind of what these earlier civilizations in America were like. And we have not just the oral traditions of the Native Americans to tell us that, but also archaeological evidence, most notably in what we've excavated from these various mounds that have been found all over the United States, and which used to number in the hundreds of thousands. And they were likely built by a race that came over here from the old world to the new. So there's a lot of cultural diffusionism that happened in pre-Columbian America, which doesn't really get talked about and which really gets overlooked in mainstream academia and scholarship. And when we were in high school and with kids in high school, they're just not being taught this stuff. So part of what I feel is my duty, my contribution to the study of history is to really highlight a lot of this stuff that's not been talked about and that's been avoided.
Well, with your book that you've written, without giving too much away, what can you tell us about your book and its influences that got you to write it?
Yeah, certainly. I'd be happy to. So I had read a book by a guy named Richard Dewhurst, who wrote a book called The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America. And this book kind of blew me away. This is the first time I was exposed to a different perspective on pre-Columbian history than what I had been taught in school. And so Dewhurst in that book, and there have been some other scholars, James Vieira, Xavier Hayes as well, who really kind of look at the different feats that this ancient civilization did in North America. So their building structures, their inscriptions. And so what I wanted to do with my book was really try to trace the origins of this ancient civilization. So my book is really kind of a journey to uncover the origin of this ancient civilization of mound builders. And what I discovered is that they go back to the old world, and more specifically to the ancient Near East, and that they were likely some type of Egyptian, Hebraic, Egyptian Israelite hybrid group of giants who, for various reasons, most notably persecution by the Babylonians, came to the New World and settled and created a civilization of their own, but one that still had a lot of connections with the ancient Near Eastern world in its culture and in its writings.
Well, with you researching giants, do you also research megalithic sites as well?
Yes, so I've researched some domain. Mainly, I've looked at the mounds. So the mounds in more specifically the Midwest and Ohio. But I am Rodney. I'm up for looking at anything, any anomalous sites in North America. So America's Stonehenge, which I have not been to yet, but I plan to visit that as well. So any interesting site in North America, including Canada as well, I have an interest in, because I think that all of these sites are connected somehow, and all of them were built, by the same type of people.
How, with your research, have you found any evidence that shows like 500,000 years or a million years since, that anyone that has been here in America or the Americas from that far back?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's a guy, Michael Cremo. He wrote a book called Forbidden Archaeology. And there's a smaller version of that called The Hidden History of Mankind. And he gives examples of tools and of human bones, Homo sapien bones, that date way before Homo sapiens were supposed to be on the scene according to your traditional evolutionary model. So he's found megaliths in Philadelphia, in what's now modern Philadelphia, and in Mississippi, and in places throughout what is now known as the United States. So which suggests that there was some type of advanced culture here way, way back in the day, perhaps even before Clovis. Now, I don't discount the Clovis model entirely, but I think that, these really old examples that Cremo gives, Barry Fell also gives some really old examples in America BC, his book America BC. I think these examples show cultural diffusionism in being congruent with Clovis. So not everybody came to America from the Bering Strait. Not everybody came to America at the same time as the people crossing the Bering Strait, but a lot of them came way before Clovis ever happened.
Well, what does the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls say about giants?
Yes. So going back to the Noah story yet again, you have the Nephilim, who are in the Greek and Latin translations of the Noah story are called gigantes, or giants, and these giants are seen as violent. They come down and they take the daughters of men, Benot Anshe, by force, and this is one of the reasons that God decides to flood the earth and to start over again because of these giants. And I argue, actually, in my book, that these giants are the great ancestors of the giants that we get in much later on in biblical times with the Egypto-Israelites who then come to the New World. And just like those ancient giants Nephilim talked about in Genesis 6, the giants in North America were bloodthirsty and violent, and they were killed off. They killed each other off. They killed themselves off, as well. So there's a direct connection there. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are really interesting because you have a couple things going on there. First, you have text of the Book of Enoch. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent our earliest Hebrew text. We don't get anything like them until the Masoretic text, which is a medieval text in the 10th or 11th century CE, but the Dead Sea Scrolls go all the way back to around the 2nd century BCE. And they give us our earliest version of a book called the Book of Enoch. And in that book, you have a couple of things. You have these giants who, very detailed description of these giants. Their names are given, and they are described as, violent and bloodthirsty. But here's the interesting thing. Noah himself is said to have been descended from these giants. So there's a funny story. Lamech, Noah's dad, he's trying to have a kid with his wife, and it's not happening for whatever reason. Then she suddenly ends up, he's gone for a while, and then she suddenly ends up pregnant. And she's like, no, I didn't cheat. I got pregnant. I conceived right before you left. And he's like, that's bullcrap. And it turns out that she was impregnated by one of these giants. And so Noah's own blood has the blood of these giants, these Nephilim, these gigantes in him. And so I argue that, if this goes to some type of historical event with Noah being one of the eponymous ancestors of Israel, then that's how this giant bloodline is preserved. Because it's interesting, the Nephilim should have been wiped out in the flood. They existed before the flood, but they pop up again later on in Israelite history. Moses and the Israelites from Egypt encounter them, and there's several other encounters of them later on in Israelite history. So where did they come from? Well, I believe that they came through that bloodline of Noah. And I know there's that raises a whole other mountain of questions, whether the story should be taken literally or not. But I say all that because the Book of Enoch gives an explicit identification of Noah as being descended from the giants. And you also have a lot of apocalyptic writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not found in the Bible itself. So you have an end time thing where the teacher of righteousness and his followers, namely the Dead Sea Scroll community, are fighting the evil ones in the last days, and those evil ones are described as giants. So the giants are never positive, either in the Bible or in the Dead Sea Scroll literature, but both of those have a lot of things to say about the giants nonetheless.
Well, Noah's flood story, I don't know. I have a hard time with Noah's. I understand, 14, 15,000 years ago, there was something happened, caused massive flooding throughout the planet, but not like a worldwide, above Mount Everest type flood like I was preached to when I was a kid. But how is it possible for someone to build an ark and to carry the amount of animals that was told in the story of Noah? How would that be possible? Because I know a lot of scientists have put it to the test, and they said it would be impossible. One, to feed them. Two, to remove the waste. And three, to keep the predators from killing the rest of the animals.
Yeah, and that's a legit point. I'm going to put on my Von Daniken hat here, and okay. It's interesting because the term that's often translated as ark or boat, arcam in the Latin, is really a chest. So, and it's interesting because in the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin, it doesn't say, people think of a boat floating in the ocean the whole time. It's not actually what the text says. It's very interesting. It says that the chest was lifted up and floated above, literally above the earth. So, supra terram in the Latin, al haaret in Hebrew. So people, especially those who subscribe to like the ancient astronaut theory, they would say that this wasn't a boat, your average boat, but some type of huge spaceship of some type that ascended outside the Earth's atmosphere and then came back down when the flood was over. Now, if that's the case, and we're talking about like some big mothership thingy, like some Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something like for Independence Day, then anything's possible because something like that could probably fit two of every kind of animal onto it. So that's if you want to go down. That's if you want to go down that rabbit hole. The other rabbit hole that you could go down is that this is kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Embellishment of a historical story. Clearly, Noah was not the only person on the earth to survive because you have Noah's stories attested. You have similar stories attested elsewhere in every single culture. Hindu culture, there's a dude who rides a fish on a boat. African culture, you mentioned before the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it wasn't just Noah. The biblical authors make it seem like it's Noah, but it wasn't just him. So there are probably, Greco-Roman culture, to go back on that, it's Deucalion and his wife. So it's not just Noah, which makes more sense to say, we had this one guy, he gathered some animals in the ark and survived, but we have all these other people who survived as well. So it couldn't have just been Noah because we have this tradition of a flood, not just in the Bible, but in all different cultures as well.
Well, it kind of goes into going back to the beginning with Cain and Abel. With Cain killing Abel, and Cain was banished to the land of Nod where he met his wife. Who was she? Where were these people? Who? That's one thing that I always ask in church, and they're like, well, that was probably a sister. I'm like, hey, don't say that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't say that. What probably, I mentioned this in my St. Joseph's class on the Old Testament. What you probably have is a fusion of different traditions. So people outside of biblical studies, they'll read the first couple chapters of Genesis and they think it's talking about one creation story, but it's actually not. You have two different creation stories and a bunch of different traditions that once circulated orally. They were oral tales that people told around the campfire, but then they were brought together as a single whole, which make up our current modern day Bible. So you have what we call in biblical studies the priestly creation story in Genesis 1, and then you have the Yahweh's creation story in Genesis 2. And these are two sources, two authors of the entire Pentateuch. So those two different traditions are together. In the Yahweh's creation account, there are only 4 people on the land: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. But in the priestly creation account, all of humanity is created. So human beings are created in the image of God, Tselem Elohim, or Imago Dei in the Latin. So what you have is probably a fusion of these different traditions, and that accounts for the discrepancies that you get. Where it says Cain married his wife, well, that's probably drawing on the priestly creation story in that tradition, where there's a bunch of people that God has created on the earth. Similar, you get this all the time in the Bible. So you have example I like to point out to my students is the King David, the story of David. There's one story where David comes to power as a member of Saul's court, and then there's another story where, speaking of giants, he engages in combat with Goliath and defeats him. And at the end of the David and Goliath story, Saul is like, "Who is this dude?" And they go, "Oh, his name is Jesse." His name is David, the son of Jesse. Now, reading the story as a whole, Saul should know who David is already. He's been in the court of Saul. He plays music for Saul, so Saul should know who he is. So this is clear-cut evidence that we're talking about traditions that have emerged here, and when these traditions merge, there are contradictions between them.
Well, do you think that where people see Bigfoots today, do you think there could be remnants of giants, or are they maybe two different species altogether?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a couple of things are going on. I think that the giants preserve their bloodline in a lot of the Native American tribes. So you have some really tall people in Native American tribes. So I think that comes from direct influence on the giants. As I think I mentioned before, I think that the giants of Midwestern America, the ones who had the empire, the Mound Builder Empire in the Midwest, I think they killed each other off. But it's possible that some of them might have survived up until this present day, and they found different cities and places in they found different cities and habitations in places such as the Grand Canyon, and people have wanted to dig around that area more and see what they can find. So maybe there were some giants who escaped and kind of went kind of underground or to places that aren't really inhabited by human beings. So I think that when people say that they saw Bigfoot or anything, I don't want to discount what anybody says. I know some people say stuff just for the attention and popularity. I do have a good friend who examines the traditions of Bigfoot depth. She's done some really excellent research on them. So I think there may be something there. Bigfoot's always described as a giant, so I think there may be something. There. So who knows? Maybe Bigfoot is a remnant of the mound builders from ancient America.
Well, could you explain to everybody? I know you've mentioned the mounds. I know in West Virginia there's some mounds, and like you explained in Ohio. But have they done any digging to see if there's any evidence of giants or any other artifacts that have been found in these mounds, or do they even dig at them at all?
Yes. So there were there's a whole story behind this, Rodney. So when America was first settled, late 18th century into, I'd say up until the late 19th century, as people settled around these mounds, they would find basically giant skeletons. Now, some of these were hoaxes, but there were thousands of reports. So even if 5 or 10% of them were true, then that's a big deal. And we have pictorial evidence for some of these. For example, the Victoria County skulls in Arizona. Actually, I think they're in Texas. My apologies about that. So yeah, they're in Texas. So we have pictorial evidence for a lot of these. So it's not just testimony, but it's pictorial evidence for these giants. So excavated near these mounds, the mounds themselves seem to be burial places for the giants, just like the pyramids were burial places for the pharaohs. And we find not only giants in them, but armored giants. So they'll have iron helmets and swords and stuff like that. And we also find them in Ohio. They in the Newark earthworks. We also find them with different Semitic inscriptions, and some of the inscriptions contain quotes from the Hebrew Bible. And those West Virginia mounds that you mentioned, those seem to me, I would argue, to be part of that larger empire from which had its base in Ohio. Scholars such as myself would identify them as the Hopewell and Adena people, West Virginia, and some of the mounds in upper state New York would seem to come from them as well.
Well, is there any evidence or any any evidence or any stories about any paranormal or any other UFO activity or anything like that around these mounds?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. That's something I would like to research further. I do know that in the oral history of many Native American tribes, such as the Hopi Indians, there is a tradition of the Star People. It's kind of funny because if you tell a Native American, I saw a UFO, this was astounding to me, they'll shrug and say, my ancestors and people have been seeing UFOs for hundreds of thousands of years. So there's a tradition of Star People coming down and instructing Native Americans, and there are Native American tribes that said they still have interaction with these star people. Now, whether there's been any UFO activity around the mounds, that's something I would need to look in. I would need to look at further. That's a fascinating question.
Okay. I don't know if you've seen this, but there is a footprint that is found in South Africa, a giant footprint, like 5'8".
Yes.
Print embedded in granite. What is your opinion about that? Because I know the researcher, I can't remember his name offhand, but he was talking that this is like millions of years old and it's huge. Do you have any opinions or thoughts, or have you even seen this evidence?
Yes. That's I have seen that footprint. So I think that, I talk about the Egypto-Israelite giants a lot, but you have giants found and attested to, and Xavier Hayes does an excellent job of pointing this out in his book, Ancient Giants. You have traditions of giants all over the world: Irish, German, Chinese, Egyptian again, and African. So I think that footprint is part of this other group of giants that existed in that region. And it's funny because if you look at the Olmec people in South America, there's some statues that have what scholars would term Negroid features, and they seem to have been a very, very tall person. So it's possible, going back to cultural diffusionism, that the giants that lived in South Africa at that time, the giants who lived in South Africa might have in some way crossed over the Atlantic into the New World, into South America. So we may be talking about the same group of people, the Olmecs being the same as that group in South America. But yes, I definitely think that is evidence, very good evidence for the existence of giants in Africa's ancient past, and not just Africa, but like I said, all over the world.
Well, would that explain a lot of these megalithic sites where these stones are so massive that a lot of equipment that we have today can't even budge them? Okay.
Yes. So I think, I know. I mean, it's amazing what they were able to do. I mean, we have all this awesome, technology now, and it's amazing what they were able to do back then. And I think that you could say that a couple things are going on. First off, to give a kind of a paranormal explanation, a lot of the skulls of the giants that we found in North America are elongated or bigger than normal, so they have a bigger cranial region. And I've mentioned this before on other shows, but I think that might imply additional usage of the brain, so some type of psychic activity by which they were able to, move these massive stones into place. I know that at least in Europe with Stonehenge, people have speculated that might have been the case as well. The Druids used psychic ability to move teleportation, to move these stones. So that's something that could be going on. That's something that could be going on there. But I mean, it's fascinating because you look at some of these places and they're built the way they're built. They're built in a way that your average human being can't even climb these things. But if you're a giant person, you could. So that's evidence for me that yes, these megaliths do attest to giants as their creators, as the people who built them.
Now, do you think these giants were human, even though they supposedly look human and have a lot of human characteristics, but is it possible that they were aliens?
That's a good question, and I mentioned that in my book. I bring this up. I think the giants were human, but of a different species than we are now, but close enough to breed with us. There's a lot, and it was interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned this, Rodney, because I was reading an article on Facebook just this morning talking about how part of the human DNA is part of modern human DNA. Has for a part of it belongs to a species of human that is unknown, that scientists still have not identified. So we have these various types of human beings throughout history. Homo sapiens, of course, being us. But I think that we don't know who these other species of humans were. Andrew Collins and Craig Little, they've done some really good work on this, arguing that a lot of the giants in North America stem from the Denisovans, who were kind of a subset or a different branch of human species than Homo sapiens.
Hmm. Well, I've also read that researchers have found, while studying fossilized footprints located in Utah that date back 500 million years, and in New Mexico, a footprint that dates back 250 million years. Is it possible that man or some other humanoid was around that long ago?
I think so. So I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I don't want to get too far out of my field, but I think that at the end of the day, the archaeological evidence, what you just said, clearly points to human beings being here a lot earlier than traditional evolutionary biology tells us. And also, it kind of flips the evolutionary model on its head. So we're assuming, if you take your Evolution 101 class in college, that lower life forms, lower versions of humanity become more evolved, and you eventually get Homo sapien. But what appears to be the case is that you have these giant persons with their footprints, with evidence of them all throughout the world, being the earliest versions of humanity, and then slowly there's kind of a digression, if that's even a word. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, instead of an evolution, it's kind of a de-evolution to what you get with modern Homo sapiens. So we are smaller and we're less powerful than our ancestors. And you get this a lot in the mythology of various cultures. So in Greco-Roman mythology, yes, I like to always jump back on that. If you ever read Homer talks about in the Iliad and especially in the Odyssey, Homer talks about the men of the past being much mightier than the men of his present time. And so he'll compare people in the Trojan War saying, this guy could take an arrow straight to his chest and still come out swinging and be perfectly fine. But if a person from Homer's time got an arrow in their chest, they'd be dead. So I think that a lot of this archaeological evidence, not just the earliness of it, but also the fact that human beings seem to have been very advanced from a very early period, really throws a lot of the traditional evolutionary views into question.
Well, I read that Captain John Smith experienced a group of giants in America. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. So John Smith, yes. So John Smith actually encounters some Indians who tell him this tradition about these ancient giants. And he said, and it's interesting because Native Americans say to John Smith, they say, we weren't the first inhabitants here. These giants were here before us. And when we came into this region, we got into fights with these giants because they did not want us there. So he's important because the oral traditions that he records to the Native Americans seem to support very strongly the view that a giant, a race of giants, existed in North America and had their own empire at one time.
Well, what is your opinion on why history, governments, universities, etc., are holding these findings and this knowledge of giants from the public?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of things going on here, Rodney. First off, and I have to say, as a person of color, I don't jump to racism I try not to jump onto racism for everything, but I think that there is some anti-Native American racism that is embedded into how we understand American history. When America was being founded, there were disputes between the government and the Indians all the time taking place. And so the way that, you kind of defeat the Native American, you not only take away his land, but you also project a history, you also create a history where he is inferior to the civilizations around him. So you don't want any evidence that there was an advanced civilization before Columbus, before these American colonists came on the scene. You don't want any evidence of that to really be known to the public. And so this is where you get your standard, in my view, stereotyped view of Native Americans running through the forest, eating berries, living in tents. There's only, and I was talking to somebody else about this on another podcast, there's only a couple of tribes of Native Americans who actually live in tents and are nomadic. Most Native Americans, if you give their tradition, if you talk about their history and the traditions of where they came from, they'll say, back in the day there were these cities and stuff like that. So I think that there was a deliberate attempt to suppress ancient American history, and especially that history that would present the Native American in a positive light as having civilization before Columbus and before the United States. So I think that's going on there. I also think that, I'm somewhat biased because I'm Mormon myself, but especially in the 19th century with Mormonism coming on the scene, there's also an agenda to suppress any evidence that might suggest cultural diffusionism, especially from the ancient Near Eastern world. So people don't want to see evidence for that because in some ways that supports the Mormon view that Israelites came over from the ancient world and settled in the New World. But I think primarily there is this bias against Native Americans. I think that American history has gotten better with this, but it's still so deeply ingrained into our history. I mean, if you go to the Smithsonian, I went last year with my family. If you go to the Smithsonian, it's the same old thing. It's just, these Native Americans lived in tents. They made these dolls with beads. Just basically a dumbing down of the really advanced culture that Native Americans and pre-Columbian Americans on this continent had.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there any records describing how tall that these giants were throughout the world? I mean, were they? I know I've read some 10 foot, 15 foot, 20 foot. What is your research shown on that?
Yeah. So the biblical giants, the terminology that's used is cubits in the Bible. And so the biblical giants range between 9 and 12 feet. Goliath, who is the most famous giant in the Old Testament, he's actually a smaller giant in comparison to his colleagues. He's only around 9 feet. But some of the other giants who are talked about in the Bible are 12 feet at least. In Irish culture, in Irish tradition, you have a woman who's a giant. She's kind of like this goddess slash heroine, and she is around 9 feet tall as well. Now, when we get to the North American giants, we have claims that some of them were as tall as 13 feet. And then we have actual written traditions from the settlers, European settlers who come and have fights with some of the Native American tribes who are descended from these giants. And it says that these Native Americans were at least 7 feet tall. So at least, at the smallest, the size of your NBA basketball player, and at their at the absolute tallest, I'm around 13 feet, which is fascinating.
Yes. Oh, wow. Well, did they have the 2 rows of teeth and 6 fingers and 6 toes, as a lot of books and some shows describe?
So in the Old Testament, there's several giants who are mentioned as having additional fingers and toes. Some of the giants, so we get several different types of giants in North America. Some of them have the elongated skull, the cranial skull that I talked about. Others of them, like the Victoria County giants in Texas, they have huge skulls, but they don't look different. They're not deformed in any way. They don't look different than a regular human skull. They're just bigger. So you have some giants who look like modern-day humans with no abnormalities, I should say, but they're just taller than everyone else. And then some giants look incredibly different. Some of them have, like I said, the enlarged cranium, and then where you get the Paracas skulls, some of those giants have additional teeth to them. So you have all of these really weird different species, even different subspecies, even within this overall species of giants. And I think that reflects, cultural diffusionism from basically migrations of different giants from all over the world.
Well, what we were talking about later in times, what were their religious beliefs with those ancient civilizations, as far as giants, or even further back than that? Have you found any evidence of their types of religion?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the Egyptian Israelite giants, and I argue this in my book, when you look at some of the inscriptions uncovered at the Newark earthworks and some of the other Hebrew and Semitic inscriptions that we found elsewhere in the United States, Los Limas Decalogue stone, the Bat Creek stone, stuff like that, their religion was clearly some form of Israelite religion, or I guess how I would say proto-Judaism in some way, since they're coming from ancient Israel themselves. So their religion seems to have been very much kind of the same type of biblical religion that you get in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, in other traditions that we have about giants, so for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is himself kind of described as a giant, so is Enkidu, and their religion is Sumerian religion, polytheism. So it really kind of depends on the culture from which the giants emerged. So for Sumerian culture, it would have been polytheism, but for the Sumerian giants, it would have been polytheism, but for the giants in Israel, it would have been biblical monotheism, or monolatry, as I like to call it. They weren't really monotheist in the way that we understand the term in modern Western culture.
Okay. Well, why was gold so important to the ancient peoples? And what made them decide that gold was so precious?
That's a good question. I know that with Stitchin, Zechariah Stitchin talks about the Anunnaki, who he identifies as giants. I don't necessarily agree with him on that, but he would argue that the gold was used as kind of a resource that the Anunnaki took back to their homeworld and used for their homeworld. So they basically used human beings on Earth as slaves to dig up this gold, which they needed to preserve their own homeworld. Like I said, not quite sure if I buy that for myself. The giants were humans. They always they were created on this earth, and they always existed on this earth. They didn't come from someplace else. I know less about the gold and more about copper. So the Hopewell Adena people, the people who who were the mound builders in the Midwest in Ohio, they exported copper all around the world. They had a copper mill, and they had this thing from way, way back, well into the first millennium BCE. So this was something that was taking place way, way back. And this is something that if you press mainstream archaeologists on it, they really don't deny it. There's clear evidence of copper trade. There are inscriptions with ships on them. So these people got around.
Yeah, because I read something that there were copper mines somewhere in the Michigan area or Minnesota.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And all that is part of the Great Lakes area, all of that is part of what I would consider the Howell-Nedina Empire. And so the copper for them, they knew that other places needed it. So so they're probably traveling to, Europe, to the Near East, and exchanging and trading this copper. So they know it's important, and they know that, having this copper mine is kind of the key to enriching their empire. And a lot of, I should mention, a lot of the excavations that were done where they found giants, the giants will be buried with copper jewelry, which also suggests that they saw it as a status symbol. So why was copper important? It was important for trade, and it also reflected your status within society.
Wow. Well, what's your opinion about Atlantis?
Yes. So I think that, and I've mentioned this on some other podcasts as well, the giants, so you have the giants in Genesis 6, who are said to have been the heroes of old, Anshe Shem in the Hebrew, men of the name literally, and it doesn't say where they're from, but I think that at the end of the day, they come from a civilization that is so old, people writing about them later on didn't remember it. But I think that civilization, I think that there is a connection between this unnamed civilization and what Plato and others identify as Atlantis. I think Atlantis, you could argue that Atlantis is the original home of the giants, and that's something I'd like to look at in more detail. But a lot of people, Gavin Menzies, for example, have written some really great books on Atlantis, and that's something that I need to research more on. But Atlantis, at least the way that Plato describes it, seems to me to be a big contender as the place of origin for the giants.
Well, where do you believe ancient civilization began for the first time, or do you think it might have began in multiple areas at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that, the standard model is to say that everything, came out of Africa. Humans evolved, and then they started to make civilization, and it went from Africa and spread out elsewhere. But I think that the archaeological evidence and the fossils that we find all over the world really kind of point against that. I think you have multiple civilizations popping up all around the world at the same time. And there's a guy, Bruce Fenton, he's actually contributed to another podcast, Earth Ancients, but he has written a book about this, basically calling it the into Africa model instead of the out of Africa model, and really kind of showing how humans and civilization develops all over the world at pretty much the same time. He doesn't really go into why this is the case. He speculates, even brings in some UFO stuff in there. But I do agree with his point that instead of seeing human civilization starting in one particular place and spreading out, it started in a bunch of different places simultaneously.
Well, what's your thoughts on the Buddha statue that was carved, or that was found in a cave? Sorry, it's been a long day. That was found in a cave at the Grand Canyon, and also the Egyptian artifacts that supposedly were found at the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. So there is, and I think that this points directly to Near Eastern influence. So I mentioned that the giants were Egyptian-Israelite hybrids. So they brought something not only from Israelite culture, but from Egyptian culture as well. And we see this most notably with the mounds. The mounds, so for example, Monk's Mound is exact same dimensions as the Great Pyramid of Giza, 13.5 hectares, I believe. Same exact dimensions as the Pyramid of Giza, but not just that, but they brought some of Egyptian religion with them as well. So you have in the Grand Canyon what's been found is, I believe there was a statue of a little figure of a pharaoh, suggesting that whoever was there was part of a royal line somehow that traced itself back to Egypt. Sarah Farmer has done some work on this in a book published, book edited by Frank Joseph called The Lost Colonies of Ancient America. She talks about this in more depth. You also have a mummified cat. So clearly these people, so I mentioned that the mound builders in North America, their religion was probably some form of Proto-Judaism or Israelite religion. But I think you also had some who worshipped the Egyptian gods. And that would account for, that mummified cat. Cats were sacred to Egyptian society, such as Bastet, very important god or goddess, I should say, in the Egyptian pantheon. So I think that all of this is evidence that these people are coming, one, evidence for cultural diffusionism, and two, more specifically, cultural diffusionism from the ancient Near East.
Okay. With your research, do you know of any research that's going on about America or North America's past that's going on by other researchers that's kind of being hush-hush in the community of sciences?
Yeah. I think the best example of this is James Vieira, amazing researcher, awesome researcher. He had a show called In Search of Giants on the History Channel a few years back, and he tried to show where you have clear-cut evidence of these giants all throughout North America, and was basically lambasted by mainstream academia in a very harsh and, in my opinion, a very cruel way, even though he, dotted every I and crossed every T and was very meticulous about his research. But I think, there's a lot of voices that have emerged recently that are really pushing back on the traditional view of America, pre-Columbian America, as uncivilized, and really showing that there was a really in-depth and rich culture and civilization that was here before that time. So I think people like Frank Joseph and Wayne May and Andrew Collins and Greg Little and Richard Dewhurst, Zavian Hayes, all these people are, doing really great work and kind of pushing back on that model. I think we're very slowly starting to see more acceptance of cultural diffusionism than we ever had before.
That's awesome. Well, here's a question I'd like to ask my guest, unless it's the topic that we're talking about. Have you had any personal experiences, with the paranormal or crypto or UFO encounters?
Oh, that's a good question. Kind of a personal question too. Yes, I have actually. I have had two encounters that I've reported to the Mutual UFO Network. These were a couple of years ago. Both of them, ironically, as I was driving my son back from my grandmother's, from my mother-in-law. One of them took place in Pennsylvania, Bensalem, Pennsylvania, where I used to live, and the other one took place on I-95. And it was funny because when I talked to the MUFON person and I told them we're on I-95, they said, yes, we get UFO sightings there all the freaking time. So, yes, I have had two I have had to experience where I've seen unidentified flying objects that I couldn't explain. Now, I mention this because I live in South Jersey. I'm right over the bridge from Philadelphia, and there's like billions and billions and billions of airplanes always flying around. So even though I'm not an aviator, I do know, the green and yellow, green and red landing lights that airplanes have. I can identify an airplane, and in those two instances, these were completely different than any airplane or helicopter that I've seen. I believe that they were UFOs. They were UFOs.
Wow. Well, I'll ask a couple more questions and I'll let you go, sir. I mean, I appreciate you coming on.
This has been a blast. My pleasure.
Do you what's the future with your research, and do you have any future books coming out?
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned that because today on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, I have going back to my interest in the Bible, I have a translation from the Latin Vulgate that just came out called the Latin Scrolls. So if you type in Latin Scrolls, Adam Stokes, it'll pop up on Barnes and Noble and on Amazon. So that's my most latest work, my latest research. I've slowed down things a bit because with COVID, I've just been home with my kids and my wife. So not doing as much writing, but I have a couple of projects on the back burner. Going to my interest in Greco-Roman mythology, I have a couple of articles that I'm trying to write for ancient origins on the Greco-Roman gods. And I also have a review that just came out in Ancient American Magazine on Andrew Collins and Greg Little's Denisovan origins. So that just came out a couple weeks back. So that's my latest. One thing I do when I don't have time to write, I have an Instagram account called Adam the Giant Guy 2019, and I post stuff on there. I also have, I do tutoring in my spare time, so I also have a tutoring page called Lingua Classica. And so it's a Facebook page, Lingua Classica Tutoring, and I'm always putting stuff about my upcoming projects on there. So, so that's what I've been up to lately.
Well, what's your plans for the rest of 2020? I think you kind of covered it, because that's normally my last three questions is, what's your plans for 2020, and how can people get in touch with you if they want to talk to you or ask you any questions?
Yeah. My Instagram account's the best way to get in touch with me, and Lingua Classica as well. But yeah, you know what? It's funny you mention that, Rodney, because as a teacher, I'm not sure we're all debating both at the college I teach at and at the high school, whether we're going to do on campus or a mixture of on campus or online. So nobody knows what's up. So my answer to the question, what are my plans for 2020? I'm going to be teaching, but I just don't know how the heck I'm going to do it, whether it's going to be on campus or online.
I know they're having a problem with that down here, trying to figure out whether they're going to do on campus or online. So I think it's all over the country. And with the COVID, the heat back up again, like I mentioned at the first part of the show, it's scary. It's really scary, especially in my area. People down here are not taking it seriously. And, I got a lot of health problems. So, I wear a mask. My granddaughter, she wears a mask. My wife, my kids, But when we go to the store, no masks.
Yeah. Well, we have to, in New Jersey, all the stores it's by law. Like the stores are opening up, but you have to wear a mask. So everybody wears a mask. I have my Darth Vader face mask. My kids have my mask if I take them out. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's scary, man. My dad, who is in a nursing home, he was diagnosed with dementia a few years back, but he's in a nursing home. He caught COVID, recovered from COVID, so he's okay now. But I think, like you said, people need to take this seriously. And I get the concern, about the government, overextending itself. Are there people in the government who are using this for their advantage? Absolutely. But, we should still be careful as well and wear those face masks because we don't want people, with compromised immune systems or the elderly to be hurt. We may get it and it may not affect us, but it will affect other people if we spread it to them.
Exactly. Well, Adam, it has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on, sir. In the future, I hope you
This is awesome.
would like to come back on because I love talking about Giants history, all this. I mean, I could have went so much more in the Roman and also the religious part, but I wanted to nail down more of the Giants. So it was a great interview, and again, sir, it's such an honor and a privilege, and I appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome, sir. You have a great weekend and a great 4th of July.
Thank you. You too, Rodney. You too. Take care.
Okay, you too. Take care, sir.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Well, everyone, I want to again thank Adam for coming on the show. Like I said, nothing but respect for him. And the man's got a lot of different jobs that he's doing as far as his research, and I love it. I love it when I get people like him on the show and I can learn so much. Our guest for Thursday, August 6th, because I'm going to take the month of July off. I'm going to take some rod time. I'm going to work around my house. I'm going to do some camping, fishing, hiking, spend some time with my family and friends. So everyone have a great 4th of July. Enjoy your summer. And until August, everyone stay safe. And please stay safe. That's it for us tonight. I want to thank everyone that took the time to listen in. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Vibe Radio Network and to Ryan for putting up with us. Also to all the first responders and our men and women in the armed services. Thank you for your service and the sacrifices that you and your families make every day to keep our great nation safe. Tune in next week to another exciting show starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Everyone can go to our Facebook page Within the Chaos, and don't forget to like our page to see upcoming guests along with past shows, postings, or you can also go to my website at www.blackdiamondps.org or blogtalkradio.com/Vibe Radio Network. Also, we have a YouTube channel, so go to YouTube, look up Within the Chaos for past shows. Thanks again. Until next week, everyone have a safe weekend and have a good night. And love you all. Be careful out there.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we We have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world, millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, or what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men, machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery, fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!